Story of the Inexperienced Ghost by H. G. Wells. The scene amidst which Clayton told his last story comes back very vividly to my mind. There he sat, for the most part of the time, in the corner of the authentic settle by the spacious open fire, and Sanderson sat beside him, smoking the Broseley clay that bore his name. There was Evans, and that marvel among actors, Wish, who is also a modest man. We had all come down to the Mermaid Club that Saturday morning, except Clayton, who had slept there overnight, which indeed gave him the opening of his story. We had golfed until golfing was invisible, we had dined, and we were in that mood of tranquil kindliness when men will suffer a story. When Clayton began to tell one, we naturally supposed he was lying. It may be that indeed he was lying. Of that the reader will speedily be able to judge as well as I. He began, it's true, with an air of matter-of-fact anecdote, but that, we thought, was only the incurable artifice of the man. "I say," he remarked, after a long consideration of the upward rain of sparks from the log that Sanderson had thumped. "You know, I was alone here last night." "Except for the domestics," said Wish. "Who sleep in the other wing," said Clayton. "Yes. Well—" He pulled at his cigar from some little time as though he still hesitated about his confidence. Then he said, quite quietly, "I caught a ghost." "Caught a ghost, did you?" said Sanderson. "Where is it?" And Evans, who admires Clayton immensely and has been 4 weeks in America, shouted, "Caught a ghost, did you, Clayton? I'm glad of it. Tell us all about it right now." Clayton said he would, in a minute, and asked him to shut the door. He looked apologetically at me. "There's no eavesdropping, of course, but we don't want to upset our very excellent service with rumours of ghosts in the place. There's too much shadow and oak panelling to trifle with that. And this, you know, wasn't a regular ghost. No, I don't think it will come again, ever." "What, you mean to say you didn't keep it?" said Sanderson. "I hadn't the heart to," said Clayton. And Sanderson said he was surprised. We laughed, and Clayton looked aggrieved. "I know," he said, with the flicker of a smile, "but the fact is, it really was a ghost. And I'm as sure of it as I'm talking to you now. I'm not joking. I mean what I say." Sanderson drew deeply on his pipe, with one reddish eye on Clayton, and then emitted a thin jet of smoke more eloquent than many words. Clayton ignored the comment. "It's the strangest thing that has ever happened in my life. You know, I never believed in ghosts or anything of the sort before, ever. And then, you know, I bag one in a corner and the whole business is in my hands." He meditated still more profoundly, and produced and began to pierce a second cigar with a curious little stabber he affected. "You talked to it?" asked Wish. "For the space probably of an hour." "Chatty," I said, joining the party of skeptics. "The poor devil was in trouble," said Clayton, bowed over his cigar end with the very faintest note of reproof. "Sobbing?" someone asked. Clayton heaved a realistic sigh at the memory. "Good Lord," he said, "yes." And then, poor fellow, yes. "Where did you strike it?" asked Evans in his best American accent. I never realized, said Clayton, ignoring him, the poor sort of thing a ghost might be. And he hung us up again for a time, while he sought for matches in his pocket, and lit and warmed to his cigar. I took an advantage, he reflected at last. We were none of us in a hurry. "A character," he said, "remains just the same character for all that it's been disembodied. that's a thing we too often forget. People with a certain strength or fixity of purpose may have ghosts of a certain strength and fixity of purpose. Most haunting ghosts, they must be as one-idead as monomaniacs and as obstinate as mules to come back again and again. This poor creature wasn't. He suddenly looked up rather queerly, and his eye went round the room. "I say it," he said, "in all kindliness, but that's the plain truth of the case. Even at the first glance, he struck me as weak." He punctuated with the help of a cigar. "I came upon him, in the long passage. His back was to me, and I saw him first. Right off I knew him for a ghost. He was transparent, whitish. Clean through his chest I could see the glimmer of the little window at the end. And not only his physique, but his attitude struck me as being weak. He looked, as though he didn't know in the slightest whatever he was meant to do. One hand was on the panelling, and the other fluttered to his mouth, like so." "What sort of physique?" said Sanderson. "Lean. That sort of young man's neck that has 2 great flutings down the back, here and here, so, and a little meanish head with scrubby hair, rather bad ears, shoulders bad, narrower than the hips, turned-down collar, ready-made short jacket, trousers baggy, little frayed at the heels. That's how he took me. I came very quietly up the staircase. I did not carry a light, The candles are on the landing table, and there is that lamp. And I was in my list slippers, and I saw him as I came up. I stopped dead at that, taking him in. I wasn't a bit afraid. I think that in most of these affairs one is never nearly so afraid or excited as one imagines one would be. I was surprised and interested, and I thought, good Lord, here's a ghost at last. And I haven't believed for a moment in ghosts during the last 25 years. Said Wish. I suppose I wasn't there a moment before he found out I was there. He turned on me sharply, and I saw the face of an immature young man, a weak nose, scrubby little moustache, feeble chin. So, for instance, we stood, he looking over his shoulder at me, and we regarded one another. Then he seemed to remember his high calling. He turned round, he drew himself up, projected his face, raised his arms, spread his hands in approved ghost fashion, came towards me, and as he did so his little jaw dropped, and he emitted a faint, drawn-out "Boo!" No, it wasn't not a bit dreadful. I'd dined, I'd had a bottle of champagne, and being all alone, perhaps 2 or 3, perhaps even 4 or 5 whiskies, so I was solid as rocks, and no more frightened than if I'd been assailed by a frog. "Boo!" I said. "Nonsense. You don't belong to this place. What are you doing here?" I could see him wince. "Boo!" he said. "Oh, boo be hanged! Are you a member?" I said, and just to show I didn't care a pin for him, I stepped through a corner of him and made to light my candle. "Are you a member?" I repeated, looking at him sideways. He moved a little so as to stand clear of me, and his bearing became crestfallen. "No," he said, in answer to the persistent interrogation of my eye. "I'm not a member. I'm a ghost." "Well, that doesn't give you the run of the Mermaid Club. Is there anyone you want to see, or anything of that sort?" And doing it as steadily as possible, for fear that he should mistake the carelessness of whiskey for the distraction of fear, I got my candle alight. I turned on him, holding it. "What are you doing here?" I said. He had dropped his hands, and stopped his booing, and there he stood, abashed and awkward, the ghost of a weak, silly, aimless young man. "I'm haunting," he said. "You haven't any business to," I said in a quiet voice. "I'm a ghost," he said as if in defence. That may be, but you haven't got any business to haunt here. This is a respectable private club. People often stop here with nursemaids and children, going about in the careless way that you do. Some poor little mite might easily come upon you and be scared out of her wits. I suppose you didn't think of that." "No, sir," he said, "I didn't." "Well, you should have done. You haven't any claim to the place, have you? Weren't murdered here or anything of the sort?" "None, sir, but as I thought it was old and oak-panelled, that's no excuse." I regarded him firmly. "Your coming here is a mistake," I said, in a tone of friendly superiority. I feigned to see if I had my matches, and then looked up at him frankly. "If I were you, I wouldn't wait for cockcrow. I'd vanish right away." He looked embarrassed. "The fact is, sir," he began. "I'd vanish," I said, driving it home. "The fact is, sir, that somehow I can't." "You can't?" "No, sir, there's something I've forgotten. I've been hanging about here since midnight last night, hiding in the cupboards of the empty bedrooms and things like that. I'm flurried. I've never come haunting before, and it seems to put me out." "Put you out?" "Yes, sir. I've tried to do it several times, and it doesn't come off. There's some little thing slipped me, and I can't get back." That, you know, rather bowled me over. He looked at me in such an abject way that for the life of me I couldn't keep up quite the high acting vein I'd adopted. "That's queer," I said, and as I spoke I fancied I heard someone moving about down below. "Come into my room and tell me more about it," I said. I didn't, of course, understand this, and I tried to take him by the arm, but of course you might as well have tried to take hold of a puff of smoke. I had forgotten my number, I think. Anyhow, I remember going into several bedrooms. It was lucky I was the only soul in that wing, until I saw my traps. "Here we are," I said, and sat down in the armchair. "Sit down and tell me all about it. It seems to me you've got yourself into a jolly awkward position, old chap." Well, he said he wouldn't sit down. He preferred to flit up and down the room, if it was all up the same to me. And so he did, and in a little while we were deep in a long and serious talk. And presently, you know, something of those whiskies and sodas evaporated out of me, and I began to realize just a little what a thundering rum and weird business it was that I was in. There he was, semi-transparent, the proper conventional phantom, and noiseless, except for the ghost of a voice, flitting to and fro in that nice, clean, chintz-hung old bedroom. You could see the gleam of the copper candlesticks through him, and the lights of the brass fender, and the corners of the framed engravings on the wall. And there he was, telling me all about this wretched little life of his that had recently ended on earth. He hadn't a particularly honest face, you know, but being transparent, of course, he couldn't avoid telling the truth. "Eh?" said Wish, suddenly sitting up in his chair. "What?" said Clayton. "Being transparent, couldn't avoid telling the truth. I don't see it," said Wish. "I don't see it," said Clayton with inimitable assurance, "but it is so. I can assure you, nevertheless, I don't believe he once got a nail's breadth of the Bible truth. He told me how he'd been killed. He went down into a London basement with a candle to look for a leakage of gas, and described himself as a senior English master in a London private school when that release occurred." "Poor wretch," said I. "That's what I thought, and the more he talked, the more I thought it. There he was, purposeless in life and purposeless out of it. He talked of his father and mother and his schoolmaster, and all who had ever been anything to him in the world, mainly. He had been too sensitive, too nervous. None of them had ever valued him properly or understood him, he said. He had never had a real friend in the world, I think. He'd never had success. He bad-shirked games, failed examinations. "It's like that with some people," he said. "Whenever I get into the examination room or anywhere, everything seems to go. Engaged to be married, of course, to another oversensitive person, I suppose. When the indiscretion with the gas escape ended his affairs." "And where are you now?" I asked. "Not in—" He wasn't clear on that point at all. The impression he gave me was of a sort of vague intermediate state, sort of special reserve for souls too non-existent for anything so positive as either sin or virtue. I don't know. He was much too egotistical and unobservant to give me any clear idea of the kind of place, the kind of country there is in the other side of things. Wherever he was, he seems to have fallen in with a set of kindred spirits, ghosts of weak Cockney young men who were on a footing of Christian names, and among these there was certainly a lot of talk about going haunting, and things like that. Yes, going haunting. They seemed to think haunting a tremendous adventure, and most of them funked it all the time. And so primed, you know, he had come. "But really," said Wish to the fire. "These are the impressions he gave me, anyhow," said Clayton modestly. "I may, of course, have been in a rather uncritical state, but that was the sort of background he gave to himself. He kept flitting up and down with his thin voice going, talking about his wretched self, and never a word of clear, firm statement from first to last. He was thinner and sillier and more pointless than if he had been real and alive. Only then, you know, he wouldn't have been in my bedroom here if he had been alive. I should have kicked him out." "Of course," said Evans. "There are poor mortals like that, and there's just as much chance of their having ghosts as the rest of us," I admitted. What gave a sort of point to him, you know, was the fact that he did seem within limits to have found himself out. The mess he had made of haunting had depressed him terribly. He'd been told it would be a lark. He had come expecting it to be a lark, and here it was, nothing but another failure added to his record. He proclaimed himself an utter and out failure. He said, and I can quite believe it, that he had never tried to do anything all his life that he hadn't made a perfect mess of, and through all the wastes of eternity he never would. If he had had sympathy, perhaps— He paused at that and stood regarding me. He remarked that, strange as it might seem to me, nobody, not anyone, ever had given him the amount of sympathy I was doing now. Oh, I could see what he wanted straight away, and I determined to head him off at once. I may be a brute, you know, but being the only real friend, the recipient of the confidences of one of these egotistical weaklings, ghosts or body, is beyond my physical endurance. I got up briskly. "Don't you brood on these things too much," I said. "The thing you've got to do is to get out of this. Get out of this sharp. You pull yourself together and try." "I can't," he said. "You try," I said, and try he did. "Try," said Sanderson. "How?" "Passes," said Clayton. "Passes?" "Complicated series of gestures and passes with the hands. That's how he had come in, and that's how he had to get out again. Lord, what a business I had!" "But how could any series of passes—" I began. "My dear man," said Clayton, turning on me and putting a great emphasis on certain words, "you want everything clear. I don't know how. All I know is that you do, that he did, anyhow. At least, after a fearful time, you know, he got his passes right and suddenly disappeared." "Did you," said Sanderson slowly, "observe the passes?" "Yes," said Clayton, and seemed to think. "It was tremendously queer," he said. "There we were, I and this thin, vague ghost in that silent room, in this silent, empty inn, in this silent little Friday night town. Not a sound, except for our voices, and a faint panting he made when he swung. There was the bedroom candle, and one candle on the dressing-table light. That was all. Sometimes one or other would flare up into a tall, lean, astonished flame for a space. And queer things happened. "I can't," he said. I shall never—" And suddenly he sat down on a little chair at the foot of the bed and began to sob and sob. Lord, what a harrowing, whimpering thing he seemed. "You pull yourself together," I said, and tried to pat him on the back, and, my confounded hand ran through him. By that time, I wasn't nearly so massive as I'd been on the landing. I got the queerness of it full. I remember snatching back my hand out of him, as it were, with a little thrill, and walking over to the dressing-table. "You pull yourself together," I said to him, "and try." And in order to encourage and help him, I began to try as well. "What?" said Sanderson. "The passes?" "Yes, the passes. But," I said, moved by an idea that eluded me for a space. "This is interesting," said Sanderson with his finger in his pipe bowl. "You mean to say this ghost of yours did his level best to give away the whole confounded barrier, yes?" "He didn't," said Wish. "He couldn't. Or you would have gone there too." "That's precisely it," I said, finding my elusive idea put into words for me. "That is precisely it," said Clayton with thoughtful eyes upon the fire. For just a little while there was silence. "And at last he did it," said Sanderson. "At last he did it. I had to keep him up to it hard, but he did it at last, rather suddenly. He despaired. We had a scene, and then he got up suddenly, and he asked me to go through the whole performance slowly, so that he might see. I believe, he said, if I could see, I should spot what was wrong at once. And he did. "I know," he said. "What do you know?" said I. "I know," he repeated. Then he said suddenly, "I can't do it if you look at me. I really can't. It's been that partly all along. I'm such a nervous fellow that you put me out." Well, we had a bit of an argument. Naturally, I wanted to see, but he was as obstinate as a mule. And suddenly I'd come over as tired as a dog. He tired me out. "All right," I said, "I won't look at you," and turned towards the mirror on the wardrobe by the bed. He started off very fast. I tried to follow him by looking in the looking-glass to see just what it was that had hung. Round went his arms and his hands, so and so and so, and then with a rush came to the last gesture of all. You stand erect, and you open out your arms, and so, don't you know, he stood. And then he didn't. He didn't. He wasn't. I wheeled round from the looking-glass to him. There was nothing. I was alone, with the flaring candles and a staggering mind. What had happened? Had anything happened? Had I been dreaming? And then, with an absurd note of finality about it, the clock upon the landing discovered the moment was ripe to striking 1. So, bing! And I was as grave and sober as a judge, with all my champagne and whiskey gone into the vast serene. Feeling queer, Confoundedly queer. Queer, good Lord. He regarded his cigar ash for a moment. "That's all that happened," he said. "And then you went to bed?" asked Evans. "What else was there to do?" I looked Wish in the eye. We wanted to scoff, and there was something perhaps in Clayton's voice and manner that hampered our desire. "And about these passes?" said Sanderson. I believe I could do them now. Oh, said Sanderson, and produced a penknife and set himself to rub the dottle out of the bowl of his clay. Why don't you do them now? Said Sanderson, shutting his penknife with a click. That's what I'm going to do, said Clayton. They won't work, said Evans. If they do, I suggested. You know, I'd rather you didn't, said Wish, stretching out his legs. Why? Asked Evans. I'd rather he didn't, said Wish. But he hasn't got them right, said Sanderson, plugging too much tobacco into his pipe. All the same, I'd rather he didn't, said Wish. We argued with Wish. He said that for Clayton to go through those gestures was like mocking a serious matter. But you don't believe, I said. Wish glanced at Clayton, who was staring into the fire, weighing something in his mind. I do. More than half. Anyhow, I do, said Wish. Clayton, said I, you're too good a liar for us. Most of it was all right, but the disappearance happened to be convincing. Tell us it's the tale of cock and bull. He stood up without heeding me, took the middle of the hearthrug and faced me. For a moment he regarded his feet thoughtfully, and then for all the rest of the time his eyes were on the opposite wall with an intent expression. He raised his two hands slowly to the level of his eyes, and so began. Now, Sanderson is a Freemason, a member of the Lodge of the Four Kings, which devotes itself so ably to the study and elucidation of all the mysteries of Masonry past and present, and among the students of this lodge Sanderson is by no means the least. He followed Clayton's motions with a singular interest in his reddish eye. "It's not bad," he said when it was done. "You really do, put things together, Clayton, in a most amazing fashion. But there's one little detail out." "I know," said Clayton. "I believe I could tell you which." "Well?" "This," said Clayton, and did a queer little twist and writhing and thrust of the hands. "Yes. That, was what he couldn't get right," said Clayton. "But how do you—" "Most of this business, and particularly how you invented it, I don't understand at all," said Sanderson. "But just that phase I do." He reflected. "These happen to be a series of gestures connected with a certain branch of esoteric masonry. Probably you know. Or else, how?" He reflected still further. "I do not see I can do any harm in telling you the proper twist. After all, if you know, you know. If you don't—" "I know nothing," said Clayton, "except what that poor devil let out last night." "Well, anyhow," said Sanderson, and placed his churchwarden very carefully upon the shelf over the fireplace. And then, very rapidly, he gesticulated with his hands. "So," said Clayton, repeating. "So," said Sanderson, and took his pipe in hand again. "Ah, now," said Clayton, "now I can do the whole thing right." He stood up before the waning fire and smiled at us all. But I think there was just a little hesitation in his smile. "If I begin," he said. "I wouldn't begin," said Wish. "It's all right," said Evans. "Matter's indestructible. You don't think any jiggery-pokery of this sort is going to snatch Clayton into the world of shades? Not it. You may try, Clayton, so far as I'm concerned, until your arms drop off at the wrists." "I don't believe that," said Wish, and stood up and put his arm on Clayton's shoulder. "You've made me half believe in that story somehow, and I don't want to see the thing done." "Goodness," said I, "here's Wish frightened." "I am," said Wish, with real or admirably faint intensity. "I believe that if he goes through these motions right, he'll go." "He'll not do anything of the sort," I cried. There's only one way out of this world for men, and Clayton is 30 years from that. Besides, and such a ghost, do you think—" Wish interrupted me by moving. He walked out from among our chairs and stopped beside the table and stood there. "Clayton," he said, "you're a fool." Clayton, with a humorous light in his eyes, smiled back at him. "Wish," he said, "is right, and all you others are wrong. I shall go. I shall get to the end of these passes, and as the last swish whistles through the air, presto! This hearthrug will be vacant. The room will be blank amazement, and a respectably dressed gentleman in 17 stone will plump into the world of shades. I'm certain. And so will you be. I decline to argue further. Let the thing be tried." "No," said Wish, and made a step and ceased. And Clayton raised his hands once more to repeat the spirit's passing. By that time, we were all in a state of tension, largely because of the behavior of Wish. We sat all of us with our eyes on Clayton, I at least with a sort of tight, stiff feeling about me, as though from the back of my skull to the middle of my thighs my body had been changed to steel. And there, with a gravity that was imperturbably serene, Clayton bowed and swayed and waved his hands and arms before us. As he drew towards the end, one piled up, one tingled in one's teeth. The last gesture, I've said, was to swing the arms out wide open with the face held up. And when at last he swung out to this closing gesture, I ceased even to breathe. It was ridiculous, of course, but you know that ghost story feeling? It was after dinner in a queer and old shadowy house. Would he, after all? There he stood for one stupendous moment, with his arms open and his upturned face assured and bright in the glare of the hanging lamp. We hung through that moment as if it were an age, and then came from all of us something that was half a sigh of infinite relief and half a reassuring "No," for visibly he wasn't going. It was all nonsense. He had told an idle story, and carried it almost to conviction. That was all. And then in that moment the face of Clayton changed. It changed. It changed as a lit house changes when its lights are suddenly extinguished. His eyes were suddenly eyes that are fixed. His smile was frozen on his lips, and he stood there still. He stood there very gently swaying. That moment, too, was an age. And then, chairs were scraping, things were falling, we were all moving. His knees seemed to give, and he fell forward, and Evans rose and caught him in his arms. It stunned us all. For a minute, I suppose no one said a coherent thing. We believed it, yet could not believe it. I came out of a muddled stupefaction to find myself kneeling beside him, and his vest and shirt were torn open, and Sanderson's hand lay on his heart. Well, the simple fact before us could very well wait our convenience. There was no hurry for us to comprehend. It lay there for an hour. It lies athwart my memory, black and amazing still, to this day. Clayton had indeed passed into the world that lies so near to and so far from our own, and he had gone thither by the only road mortal man may take. But whether he did indeed pass there by that poor ghost's incantation, or whether he was stricken suddenly by apoplexy in the midst of an idle tale, as the coroner's jury would have us believe, is no matter for my judging. It's just one of those inexplicable riddles that must remain unsolved until the final solution of all things shall come. All I certainly know is that in the very moment, in the very instant, of concluding these passes, he changed and staggered and fell down before us, dead.
Nyarlathotep by H.P. Lovecraft. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. I am the last. I will tell the audient void. I do not recall distinctly when it began, but it was months ago. The general tension was horrible. To a season of political and social upheaval was added a strange and brooding apprehension of hideous physical danger. A danger widespread and all-embracing, such a danger as may be imagined only in the most terrible phantasms of the night. I recall that the people went about with pale and worried faces, and whispered warnings and prophecies which no one dared consciously repeat or acknowledge to himself that he had heard. A sense of monstrous guilt was upon the land, and out of the abysses between the stars swept chill currents that made men shiver in dark and lonely places. There was a demoniac alteration in the sequence of the seasons. The autumn heat lingered fearsomely, and everyone felt that the world and perhaps the universe had passed from the control of known gods or forces to that of gods or forces which were unknown. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood and looked like a pharaoh. The Fellahin knelt when they saw him, yet could not say why. He said he had risen up out of the blackness of 27 centuries, and that he had heard messages from places not on this planet. Into the lands of civilization came Nyarlathotep, swarthy, slender, and sinister, always buying strange instruments of glass and metal, and combining them into instruments yet stranger. He spoke much of the sciences, of electricity and psychology, and gave exhibitions of power which sent his spectators away speechless, yet which swelled his fame to exceeding magnitude. Men advised one another to see Nyarlathotep, and shuddered. And where Nyarlathotep went, rest vanished, for the small hours were rent with the screams of nightmare. Never before had the screams of nightmare been such a public problem. Now the wise men almost wished they could forbid sleep in the small hours, that the shrieks of cities might less horribly disturb the pale, pitying moon, as it glimmered on green waters gliding under bridges, and old steeples crumbling against a sickly sky. I remember when Nyarlathotep came to my city, the great, the old, the terrible city of unnumbered crimes. My friend had told me of him, and of the impelling fascination and allurement of his revelations, and I burned with eagerness to explore his uttermost mysteries. My friend said they were horrible and impressive beyond my most fevered imaginings, that what was thrown on a screen in the darkened room prophesied things none but Nyarlathotep dare prophesy, and that in the splutter of his sparks there was taken from men that which had never been taken before, yet which shewed only in the eyes. And I heard it hinted abroad that those who knew Nyarlathotep looked on sights which others saw not. It was in the hot autumn that I went through the night with the restless crowds to see Nyarlathotep, through the stifling night and up the endless stairs into the choking room, and shadowed on a screen I saw hooded forms amidst ruins, and yellow, evil faces peering from behind fallen monuments. And I saw the world battling against blackness, against the waves of destruction from ultimate space, whirling, churning, struggling around the dimming, cooling sun. Then the sparks played amazingly around the heads of the spectators, and hair stood on end, while shadows more grotesque than I can tell came out and squatted on the heads. And when I, who was colder and more scientific than the rest, mumbled a trembling protest about imposture and static electricity, Nyarlathotep drave us all out, down the dizzy stairs into the damp, hot, deserted midnight streets. I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, that I never could be afraid, and others screamed with me for solace. We swore to one another that the city was exactly the same, and still alive, and when the electric lights began to fade, we cursed the company over and over again, and laughed at the queer faces we made. I believe we felt something coming down from the greenish moon, for when we began to depend on its light, we drifted into curious involuntary marching formations, and seemed to know our destinations, though we dared not think of them. Once we looked at the pavement and found the blocks loose and displaced by grass, with scarce a line of rusted metal to show where the tramways had run. And again we saw a tramcar, lone, windowless, dilapidated, and almost on its side. When we gazed around the horizon, we could not find the third tower by the river, and noticed that the silhouette of the second tower was ragged at the top. Then we split up into narrow columns, each which seemed drawn in a different direction. One disappeared in a narrow alley to the left, leaving only the echo of a shocking moan. Another filed down a weed-choked subway entrance, howling with a laughter that was mad. My own column was sucked towards the open country, and presently felt a chill which was not of the hot autumn. For as we stalked out on the dark moor, we beheld around us the hellish moon-glitter of evil snows. Trackless, inexplicable snows, swept asunder in one direction only, where lay a gulf all the blacker for its glittering walls. The column seemed very thin indeed, as it plodded dreamily into the gulf. I lingered behind, for the black rift in the green-litten snow was frightful, and I thought I had heard the reverberations of a disquieting wail as my companions vanished. But my power to linger was slight. As if beckoning by those who had gone before, I half floated between the titanic snowdrifts, quivering and afraid, into the sightless vortex of the unimaginable. Screamingly sentient, dumbly delirious, only the gods that were can tell. A sickening, sensitive shadow, writhing in hands that are not hands, and whirled blindly past ghastly midnights of rotting creation, corpses of dead worlds, with sores that were cities, charnel winds that brush the pallid stars and make them flicker low. Beyond the world's vague ghosts of monstrous things, half-seen columns of unsanctified temples that rest on nameless rocks beneath space and reach up to dizzy vacua above the spheres of light and darkness. And through this revolving graveyard of the universe, the muffled, maddening beating of drums and thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes from the inconceivable, unlighted chambers beyond time, the detestable pounding and piping whereunto dance slowly, awkwardly, and absurdly the gigantic, tenebrous ultimate gods, the blind, voiceless, mindless gargoyles whose soul is Nyarlathotep.
The Mysterious Bell by Anonymous. It was a dead calm. The sun beamed bright and beautiful upon the ocean in setting glory, and all life and animation had given place to that overpowering listlessness, which none can form any conception of but they who have experienced a long-continued calm at sea. I was leaning against the taffrail, gazing upon the dark waters below, in that state of apathy in which thought itself becomes almost too great an exertion, when suddenly a gentle breath of wind that swept along so lightly as to cause no ripple upon the glossy surface of the waveless deep wafted to my awakened sense a tinkling sound, like the ringing of a small bell at an immense distance. The unusual circumstance aroused my dormant faculties, and I listened with breathless attention. But the flaw had passed, and all was again silent and deathlike. I remained upon the same spot nearly an hour, but it came not again. and at length, overcome with drowsiness, I retired to my berth. The next morning, when I came upon deck, I found that the calm still continued, and the captain was of opinion that it would last some days. I mentioned to him the incident that had attracted my attention, but he laughed and said I had been dreaming. He knew we were too far from land for any sound to reach us, and no vessel, he said, could have been near enough for me to hear the ringing of the bell without also being in sight. The mate agreed with him, but I observed one weather-beaten tar who was standing near to shake his head doubtfully, and his rugged countenance betrayed great anxiety. But he said nothing. The morning passed away, still the sea was unruffled by any breeze. After dinner, to while away the tedious hours, the captain and I sat down upon the quarter-deck to cards. We had scarcely commenced playing, when I was startled by hearing the same bell-like tones, so faint and far, that nothing lived twixt them and silence. I called to the captain to listen. He sat a moment without speaking, and then started up, exclaiming, "I hear it too." The sailors seemed to have noticed it also, for they were hushed and listening. The captain went aloft with his glass, and looked in every direction. "I hear it," said he, "distinctly, but I can see nothing. It cannot be from shore, for we are more than 50 leagues from any land." The attention of all on board was now fully awake. The sailors stood upon the forecastle in anxious groups, all but the old man, the singular expression of whose features I had remarked in the morning. He sat upon the windlass, with his hands folded, and his eyes intently fixed upon the deck, but still he spoke not. Various conjectures were hazarded among us, but none that satisfactorily accounted for the noise. The afternoon passed, and the sun again set, while the tinkling sound still came floating over the waters. It was late before sleep closed my eyes that night. When the morning of the next day dawned, the captain went again to the masthead with his glass, but no sail appeared upon the horizon. Yet still the ceaseless bell was plainly to be heard, while not a breath of wind could be felt. Noon came, and still the calm continued, and the sound approached nearer and nearer, when on a sudden the captain from the top cried out, "I see it now, but what it is, God only knows. It does not look like any craft that ever the hand of man fashioned." We all rushed to the forecastle, and in silence awaited the approach of this strange navigator. It came careering over the waters with a rapid motion, and as it drew near, exhibited to our wondering gaze a single black mast, rising from the centre of what seemed a square and solid block of wood, but without yard or sail, nor did any living creature appear upon it. I proposed to take the boat and board it, but the sailors shook their heads, and the captain was silent. Determined to discover the meaning of this phenomenon, I jumped into the boat, intending to scull towards it, when the old sailor, seeing my resolution, declared that he would go with me, and the captain, after a moment's hesitation, also joined us. We rowed swiftly onwards to meet the object of our curiosity, which was now within half a mile of the ship, and in a few minutes were sufficiently near to perceive the bell at the top of the mast, the ringing of which had announced its coming. It was green and rusty as if with age, and the sides of the nondescript bark were covered with barnacles and tangled masses of seaweed. Immediately beneath the bell, which still swung from side to side with deafening din, was attached a deep sea line, passing over the side and descending into the water. The moment our boat touched this strange vessel, the bell ceased to toll, and the floating mass became immovable. We gazed upon it and upon each other in amazement, and at length the captain, in a low and tremulous voice, proposed to return, but the sailor said, "No, it was an evil hour when we met this accursed—" His voice sunk, and I could not distinguish what he uttered. "But we have met it, and we must not leave it thus. Let us haul upon this line." We did so for nearly 20 minutes, but with great difficulty, for it seemed as if some ponderous body at the extremity resisted our efforts. At length the profound stillness that had hitherto prevailed amongst us was broken by the captain, who looked down into the water and exclaimed, "Great God, what have we here?" We followed with our eyes the motion of his hand, and saw a large object glistening white beneath the waves, and appearing like a gigantic corpse, wrapped in a white cloth and bound with cords. "Now may heaven shield us," said the seaman in a husky voice. "It is the shrouded demon of the sea." As he spoke, he drew his knife from his belt, and in an instant severed the line. The body turned its white sides, flashing through the dark waters, and with the rapidity of lightning disappeared from our view.